My father was not a violent man. I need you to understand that before anything else. He never raised a hand to me, never shouted past a certain volume, never broke a dish or slammed a door in the 16 years I lived under his roof. But there was a violence in what he built, a quiet, permanent, architectural violence that pressed against every room of our house like a held breath that never released. My name is Cade Ellison. I was 16 when the shutters dropped, and I'm telling you this now because someone needs to know what it costs to survive inside another person's fear. We lived at the end of Privet Lane in Colburn, a township so small it didn't rate its own zip code. It borrowed one from Hessler, 15 minutes south. Our house sat on 2 acres of soybean field my father leased to a neighboring farmer named Gil Renford. Gil paid below market rate, but my father didn't care about the money. What he cared about was the sight line. 2 acres of flat, low crop in every direction meant you could see anything coming from 600 yards out. The steel appeared the summer I turned 9, not all at once. My father, Cade Ellison, was methodical. He started with the basement windows, 4 squat rectangles that nobody visited anyway. He removed the glass on a Saturday, measured the frames with a carpenter's pencil that he kept behind his left ear even at dinner, and by Sunday evening, 1/4-inch steel plates sat where the panes had been. Bolted from the inside, sealed with a rubberized gasket he ordered from an industrial marine catalog. My mother, still alive then, asked him why. "Draft," he said. She looked at him for a long time. Then she went back to folding laundry. That was how things worked in our house. My father made decisions about the structure. My mother made decisions about everything that happened inside it. And I occupied the shrinking space between those 2 jurisdictions, learning early that asking questions only accelerated whatever transformation my father had already planned. By the time I was 12, every window on the ground floor had been replaced. Steel plate, bolted from interior frames, he fabricated himself in the detached garage. He was a machinist by trade, 22 years at the Brannock Tool and Die Plant in Hessler. And he brought that precision home every night like other men brought home gossip or fast food. Each plate was milled to a tolerance I couldn't appreciate until years later. Each bolt was grade 8, torqued to specification, countersunk so the interior wall looked almost normal if you didn't know what was behind the drywall he laid over them. But I knew. The second-floor windows went next. Those he modified differently. Instead of solid plate, he installed hinged steel shutters on a magnetic latch system, wired to a central timer in the basement, opened during the day, closed at dusk, automatically. He programmed the timer to follow a sunset table he printed from a government astronomy website, updated every equinox. Twice a year, I would find him in the basement with a pen, adjusting minutes and seconds on a laminated chart taped above the breaker box. "Why do they need to close at night?" I asked once. I was 13. He looked at me the way he always did when I questioned the house, not angry, not dismissive, but something worse. Patient. As if I was asking why we needed a roof. "Because that's when things come," he said. My mother left when I was 14. Not dramatically. No screaming, no luggage thrown into a car. She simply wasn't there one Tuesday when I came home from school. A note on the kitchen table, written in her careful handwriting, told me she loved me, that she would call, that this wasn't about me. She kept 2 of those 3 promises. She called every Sunday for the first 2 months, and it was absolutely about me, about what kind of boy grows up in a steel box, and whether she could save me by pulling me out. But she never came back. And eventually the calls thinned to holidays, then to nothing. My father never mentioned her after the first week. He simply expanded into the space she left behind, filling it not with grief, but with additional modifications. A reinforced front door, a secondary water supply, a hand pump well he drilled in the basement floor, tapping into the same aquifer the county used. A propane generator vented through a chimney he lined with stainless steel. Shelving units bolted to basement walls, stocked with canned food rotated on a 6-month schedule. I hated every single improvement. Each one was proof that my mother had been right to leave and that I had been wrong to stay. But I stayed. The morning of October 11th, I woke to the sound of Gil Renford's combine running in the east field. It was harvest season, and the soybeans were drying on the stalk, rattling in a wind that tasted like cold iron. I lay in bed and stared at my second-floor shutters, still open, letting in a gray pre-dawn light that made everything in my room look provisional and tired. I was 16 and 3 months. I attended Hessler Regional High School, rode the bus 40 minutes each way, earned unremarkable grades in everything except shop class, where Mr. Torrance had once told me I had my father's hands. I almost dropped the course after that. The idea that any part of me was becoming Cade Ellison felt like a diagnosis. Downstairs, my father was already awake. I could hear him in the kitchen, the specific percussion of his morning, kettle on the burner, cabinet door, mug on counter, spoon against ceramic. He drank instant coffee because he considered drip machines an unnecessary failure point. That phrase, unnecessary failure point, governed half his decisions. He applied it to automatic garage doors, wireless internet, the dishwasher my mother had begged him to install. If it could break in a way that mattered, he either reinforced it or removed it. I dressed and came downstairs. He was sitting at the kitchen table with his coffee and a small radio, not digital. A hand-crank emergency model with a long antenna that he extended fully every morning, even though all it pulled in was the Hessler FM station playing country music and farm reports. "Gil's running early," I said, sitting across from him. "Frost advisory tonight. He's trying to beat it." We ate toast. He had made 2 plates, which was his version of warmth. The bread was from a loaf he baked himself every 4 days, another skill that was less hobby than contingency. He could make bread, render fat, smoke meat, purify water, suture a wound. He had taught me all of it, not gently, not cruelly, just factually, the way you'd teach someone to read a bus schedule. Here is what you need to know. Here is when you'll need to know it. I did not ask when. I already understood that his answer would be the same formless dread. It always was, a certainty without a date, a conviction that something was coming that justified every bolt he'd ever torqued and every window he'd ever sealed. School that day was ordinary in ways that felt aggressive. Hessler Regional was a building designed to produce adequacy, and it succeeded. I sat through history, biology, English, and lunch. I spoke to exactly 3 people. My lab partner, Orrin Swick, who was building a bottle rocket and needed me to hold the fins while the epoxy set. A girl named Dana Plott, who asked if she could borrow a pencil and never returned it. And Mr. Torrance, who told me my dovetail joint was the best in the class, and then looked embarrassed, as if he'd accidentally praised a stray dog, and now it might follow him home. On the bus ride back, I sat in my usual seat, 4th row, window side, and watched the Colburn landscape unroll like a quilt someone had started but never finished. Fields, tree lines, grain silos, a gas station with 2 pumps and a hand-painted sign that said bait and ammo, which I had always thought was an honest summary of rural commerce. My phone buzzed. A text from my father, which was unusual. He preferred to communicate in person or not at all. "Shutter's cycling early tonight. Come straight home." I stared at the message. He had never adjusted the shutters outside the equinox schedule. The timer was sacred to him, a mechanical covenant between the house and the sun. Overriding it meant something had changed in his calculations. And Cade Ellison did not change calculations lightly. When the bus dropped me at the end of Privet Lane, I could already see that the ground floor steel was visible. The drywall curtains my father had hung to disguise the plates from visitors had been pulled aside. The house looked like what it actually was for the first time. A bunker pretending to be a home, and not trying very hard. Gil Renford's combine was still running in the east field, but it was moving strangely, cutting diagonals instead of rows. The header bouncing over uneven ground, as if Gil had stopped steering. I watched it for 30 seconds. It carved a wide arc through standing beams, clipped a fence post, and continued south toward the tree line, without correcting. Inside the house, my father was in the basement. I could hear him checking the generator. The shutters above me began to close. It was 4:17 in the afternoon, and sunset wasn't until 6:32. The magnetic latches engaged with a sound like a series of small bones breaking. "Dad," I called down the stairs. "Close the front door, Cade. Lock the crossbar." The crossbar was a length of hardened steel channel my father had mounted across the inside of the front door 3 years earlier. It seated into reinforced brackets, bolted through the door frame and into the structural studs behind it. I had never locked it before. It was always resting in its brackets, loose, ceremonial like a museum piece you weren't supposed to touch. Now I lifted it into position and felt the weight of it settle into the frame with a sound that was deeper than a click. A commitment. "What's happening?" I asked when my father came up from the basement. He was carrying 2 things, the emergency radio and a printed sheet of paper I had never seen. He set the radio on the kitchen table and turned the crank. Static filled the room, laced with fragments of a broadcast that kept cutting in and out. A woman's voice, institutional and strained, repeating phrases that arrived in pieces. "Shelter in place until further." Not a drill. "Repeat, this is not." "Avoid contact with any individual exhibiting erratic motor behavior or..." My father adjusted the antenna. The signal clarified for a moment, and the woman's voice came through clean enough to leave bruises. "The governor has declared a state of emergency for all counties east of the Wabash Corridor. Residents are instructed to remain indoors, secure all entry points, and avoid physical contact with symptomatic individuals. Symptoms include loss of coordinated movement, unresponsive verbal behavior, and unprovoked aggression. Do not attempt to restrain or assist symptomatic individuals. Do not approach emergency vehicles unless directed by personnel. This message will repeat." The signal dissolved back into static. My father turned the volume down, but left the radio on. "Sit down," he said. I sat. He placed the printed sheet in front of me. It was a checklist, not handwritten, but typeset, formatted, printed on heavy cardstock and laminated. At the top it read, "Ellison Residence Activation Protocol." Below that were 46 numbered items organized into categories: structural, supply, communication, medical, contingency. Items 1 through 31 had already been checked off in black marker. I scanned the list. Shutters engaged, crossbar locked, generator primed, water pump tested, propane reserve confirmed, food inventory current, first aid kit accessible. He had been checking items since before I got home. Maybe since before he texted me. "How long have you known?" I asked. "Known what?" "That this was coming, not generally. Today." He sat across from me. His face did what it always did when I asked a direct question. It organized itself into patience, which looked almost exactly like pity. Gil called me at noon, said 2 of his field hands didn't show up this morning, and the one who did was walking wrong, slow, jerky, wouldn't respond when Gil spoke to him. Gil said the man walked into the combine's header while it was running and didn't scream. He paused. Gil hung up after that. I tried calling back, no answer. I thought about the combine cutting diagonals across the field. Gil's combine, running without Gil. The radio's been cycling that emergency broadcast since 1 o'clock, my father continued. I picked up a Hessler police frequency around 2. They were requesting backup for something at the elementary school. And then the channel went dead. He said this the way he said everything. Flatly, precisely, as if emotions were an unnecessary failure point. But I had lived with this man for 16 years, and I could read the micro-expressions he thought he was hiding. There was something in his eyes that I had never seen before, and could not immediately name. It took me until that evening to identify it. He was relieved. Not happy, not smug. Relieved the way a man who has been holding his breath for 20 years finally exhales when the water rises to the exact level he predicted. Every plate, every bolt, every shutter, every canned good and laminated checklist, all of it justified in a single afternoon. The house was no longer a symptom of his disorder. It was a fortress, and we were inside it. And the thing he had spent my entire childhood preparing for was here. I wanted to hate him for that relief. I wanted to throw the laminated checklist across the room and tell him that his preparedness had cost me a mother, a normal childhood, and every friendship I might have built if I hadn't been the kid whose father replaced the windows with steel. But the broadcast was still cycling on the radio, and Gil's combine was still running in the field. And somewhere in Hessler, an elementary school had gone silent. And the only thing between me and whatever was outside was the architecture of Cade Ellison's fear. So I picked up the checklist. "What's item 32? He almost smiled. Almost. "Perimeter lights. Switch is in the basement, left of the breaker box." I went downstairs to complete his protocol. His protocol, not mine. I want that distinction on record. The first night was not what I expected. I had imagined, in the vague way teenagers imagine catastrophe, that an emergency would be loud. Explosions, sirens, gunfire, screaming the vocabulary of disaster as Hollywood had taught it to me. Instead, the first night was defined by what I couldn't hear. The steel shutters were remarkably effective sound barriers. My father had lined each one with a layer of acoustic foam, not for comfort, I realized now, but to prevent whatever was outside from hearing us. The result was a silence so complete it had texture. I could hear my own pulse. I could hear the propane generator humming in the basement like a mechanical heartbeat. I could hear my father moving through his checklist with the calm efficiency of a man who had rehearsed this night 1,000 times in his mind and was finally performing it live. We ate dinner at 6:30, canned beef stew heated on the propane stove, with bread I had watched him bake 2 days earlier. He ate slowly, deliberately, as if pacing were a moral virtue. I ate fast, not from hunger, but from a need to do something with my hands that wasn't thinking. "Slow down," he said. "We have provisions for 14 months at current consumption. There's no reason to rush." 14 months. He said it the way someone might say, Tuesday. He had done the math. He had always done the math. After dinner, he walked me through the rest of the house with a flashlight, even though the generator was running and the lights worked. The flashlight was protocol. Item 37. Familiarize all occupants with the structure under reduced visibility conditions. I followed him through rooms I had lived in my entire life, and saw them for the first time as he had designed them. The basement was the core. Shelving units held canned goods organized by category and expiration date, oldest in front. A medical station occupied the southeast corner, not a first aid kit, but an actual station. With a folding table, antiseptic, suture kits, a cervical collar, and a printed field surgery manual he had laminated and bound. The hand pump well sat in the center of the floor under a steel grate, its handle polished from testing. The ground floor was the buffer zone. Every exterior wall had been reinforced from inside with steel plate behind drywall. The front door and back door were both crossbarred. The windows were sealed. He had installed 2 periscope viewers' angled mirror tubes that passed through the wall at oblique angles, allowing someone inside to see a limited slice of the exterior without exposing any opening larger than a 1/4 inch. Periscopes, I said, bending to look through one. You installed submarine periscopes in our house. Observation ports, he corrected. I pressed my eye to the viewer. The east field was visible in the last gray light, and I could see Gill's combine. It had stopped. It sat at an angle near the tree line, its header buried in soil, engine apparently dead. Something was moving near it, not Gill. Not anyone walking the way a person walks. The figure listed and corrected, like a compass needle that couldn't find north. Even at this distance, even through a tube of angled mirrors, the wrongness of the movement registered in a part of my brain that was older than language. Don't watch too long, my father said behind me. The ports aren't meant for surveillance. They're for situational awareness. There's a difference. What's the difference? Surveillance builds anxiety. Awareness builds response. I stepped back from the viewer and looked at him. He was standing in the hallway with his hands clasped behind his back, and for a moment he looked less like my father and more like a docent in the museum of his own paranoia, guiding me through an exhibit he had spent decades curating. That night, I lay in my bed on the second floor and listened. The shutters were closed, the foam was doing its work, and the house was a sealed capsule of silence. But not total silence. Sounds reached me transformed, stripped of clarity, reduced to pressure and rhythm. Something outside was moving, not walking, moving. A dragging, arrhythmic compression of gravel and grass that circled the house at irregular intervals. It would approach, pause, and then recede, as if whatever was out there was testing the perimeter the way water tests a dam, not intelligently, but persistently. I did not sleep. I lay in the dark, and I listened to something circle my father's house. And I understood for the first time that the steel between us was not a wall. It was a declaration. It said, I knew you were coming. And the thing outside, in its shuffling patience, answered, I know you're in there. 3 days passed before I heard a human voice that wasn't my father's. We had settled into a routine that Cade Ellison had clearly envisioned long before I was born. Wake at 6, breakfast from stores. Morning systems check generator fuel level. Water pump operation, radio scan, periscope survey of all 4 quadrants. Midday meal. Afternoon was designated for maintenance and improvement, which meant my father found things to reinforce and I was expected to assist. Evening meal, radio scan, periscope check, lights out at 9 to conserve fuel. He had printed the schedule, laminated it, posted it on the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a wrench. On the morning of the 3rd day, during the radio scan, a new voice broke through the static. Not the automated emergency broadcast, which had been cycling unchanged since the first night. This was a man ragged, breathing hard, transmitting on what sounded like a CB radio with a dying battery. "Anyone on this frequency? This is Porter Vance. I'm on County Road 9 near the Colburn grain elevator. I have my daughter with me. She's 11. We've been in my truck for 2 days and we're out of gas. I can see maybe 15, 20 of them between me and the elevator. If anyone can hear this, we need help. We need someone to come get us. Please. She hasn't eaten since yesterday. Please." The transmission cut to static. My father and I stood in the kitchen, the radio between us, and the silence that followed was a different species of quiet than the silence of the shutters. This was a silence that asked a question. "County Road 9 is 4 miles east," I said. 3.7. "We have a truck in the garage." "We have a truck in a reinforced garage, yes." "So we could—" "No." The word landed like the crossbar into its brackets. Final, structural. "Dad, there's a kid. There's a kid here too. I'm 16. Which is still a kid, and you're the kid I'm responsible for." That man made his choices. He's in a truck on a county road with no fuel because he didn't prepare. I'm sorry for his daughter. But opening the garage, starting the truck, driving 4 miles through unknown conditions, and attempting a rescue of strangers, that is an unnecessary risk to this household. Unnecessary risk. The cousin of unnecessary failure point. The vocabulary of his fortress, applied to a man and his daughter who were going to die 4 miles away while we ate laminated schedule meals and checked periscope quadrants. "What if it was me?" I asked. "What if I was the one on the radio?" "You're not, because I prepared." I wanted to argue. I wanted to tell him that preparation without compassion was just selfishness with a checklist. But the words didn't come, because a part of me, the part he had built, the part that knew how to check generator fuel and pump well water and read sunset tables, that part understood his logic even as it repulsed me. Porter Vance transmitted twice more that day. The second time, his voice was calmer, which was worse. He described the grain elevator, said the main door was open, said he could see supplies inside, but the things between him and the building weren't moving away. He said his daughter, whose name was Bree, was sleeping in the back seat. He said he was going to wait until dark and try to carry her to the elevator on foot. The third transmission came at 9:14 that evening, just after our scheduled lights out. My father was in the basement. I was in the kitchen. The radio crackled, and Porter Vance's voice came through one final time. "If anyone hears this later, we made it to the elevator. The door locks from inside. We have water from a utility sink. Bree is okay. She's scared, but she's okay. If you can get here, the elevator is secure. South entrance. Knock 3 times so I know you're real." Then nothing. Static. The emergency broadcast resumed its loop, indifferent and mechanical. I stood in the kitchen and I looked at the radio. And I thought about a man carrying his daughter through darkness, past things that moved wrong, reaching a grain elevator, locking a door, finding a sink. Improvised survival. No laminated checklist, no steel shutters, no 14-month provision calculation. Just a father and his daughter and a door that locked. I went to bed, and I did not tell my father about the third transmission. That was the first secret I kept inside his house, and it changed the architecture of everything that came after. By the end of the first week, the sounds outside had changed. The initial circling, that a rhythmic, searching drag, had multiplied. Through the periscopes, I could count them now in the fields around our property. Gill's soybean rows, half-harvested and browning, hosted figures that stood and swayed like scarecrows whose posts had rotted to the point of suggestion. They didn't cluster. They didn't communicate. They simply existed in the landscape with a patience that was worse than aggression, because aggression can be outlasted, but patience mirrors itself infinitely. My father documented everything. He kept a ledger, a physical, handwritten ledger, in a composition notebook, logging the number of visible figures per quadrant, time of observation, weather conditions, and behavioral notes. He wrote in a cramped, precise script that I associated with machine shop drawings. The entries were clinical. October 14th, 06:30. NE quadrant, 7 figures, stationary. Wind SW 12 miles per hour. No reaction to wind noise. SE quadrant, 3 figures near combine. One appears to be Gil Renford based on clothing. Flannel, tan work pants, confirm later observation. He confirmed it the next morning. Gil Renford, or what had been Gil Renford, stood near the buried header of his own combine, facing south, occasionally taking a step and then stopping, as if he had forgotten the purpose of movement, but still remembered the mechanism. I read the ledger when my father was doing his afternoon maintenance round. The clinical language was familiar. It was how he talked, how he thought, how he had raised me. But reading his observations of Gil, a man who had leased our land and waved to me from his combine cab every harvest season, reduced to a notation about flannel and tan work pants. Something fractured in the part of me that was still trying to find Cade Ellison's heart behind his engineering. On day 8, I began using the south periscope more than protocol required. Not for situational awareness, for surveillance. Because south was the direction of County Road 9, and somewhere past the fields and tree lines, 3.7 miles away, there was a grain elevator where a man named Porter Vance had locked a door and found a sink, and was keeping his daughter alive. I couldn't see the elevator. The periscope's field of view ended at our property line, swallowed by the tree break Gil had planted as a windrow decades ago. But I looked anyway, as if sustained attention could telescope distance, because looking south was looking toward a version of survival that my father's house could not contain. "You're spending too much time at that port," my father said on day 9. "I'm maintaining situational awareness. You're looking south. There's nothing south that affects our position." He was wrong. There was everything south. There was proof that survival without his architecture was possible. That a man with no preparation and a dying truck battery could reach shelter and hold it. That the world outside the steel was not exclusively populated by things that moved wrong. On day 10, I did something I had never done in 16 years of living under Cade Ellison's roof. I lied to him about the house. The upstairs hallway had a utility panel that controlled the magnetic latch system for the second-floor shutters. My father had shown it to me during the initial walk through a simple interface, each shutter on an independent circuit, each circuit controlled by a breaker switch and the master timer. I told him the breaker for my bedroom shutter was cycling, tripping, and resetting, making a clicking sound that kept me awake. He went to the basement to check the wiring from below. While he was downstairs, I opened the utility panel and studied the system. Each shutter had 3 states: timer controlled, manual locked, and manual open. The switch positions were labeled in my father's handwriting on strips of masking tape. I memorized the configuration and closed the panel before he came back up. "Wiring looks fine from below," he said. "Might be a relay issue. I'll fabricate a replacement." "Thanks, Dad." He studied me for a moment. His eyes had that patient, almost pitying quality that meant he was assessing whether I was telling the truth. Cade Ellison trusted his house the way he trusted physics absolutely. He trusted people the way he trusted weather provisionally, with contingency plans. He went back downstairs. I stood in the hallway and felt the weight of what I was considering settle into my chest, like the crossbar into its brackets. Not a plan yet, just an orientation, a direction. South. On day 14, my father showed me the thing he had never mentioned. We were in the basement doing inventory, his bi-weekly ritual of counting cans, checking dates, and updating the provision ledger. I was on a step stool pulling cans from the top shelf when I noticed a seam in the concrete wall behind the shelving unit. Not a crack, a seam straight, deliberate, and sealed with the same rubberized gasket material he used on the window plates. "What's behind this shelf?" I asked. He didn't answer immediately. He finished his count, wrote a number in his ledger, and then looked at where I was pointing. "Move the cans on that section, carefully." I moved them. Behind them, the shelving unit had a latch. A simple, elegant mechanism that released the unit from the wall and allowed it to swing outward on hidden hinges. Behind it was a steel door, smaller than a standard door, set into the foundation wall. The door had a handle but no lock on the inside. "This is the exit," my father said. I stared at it. "Exit to where?" "The tunnel runs 41 feet north-northeast to a terminus under the equipment shed. The shed has a hatch in the floor, concealed under the riding mower. From the shed, you have a clear line north to the Renford property line, and from there to County Road 4. A tunnel. My father had dug a 41-foot tunnel from our basement to the equipment shed. "When?" I asked. "Over 3 summers, while you were at school." I tried to imagine it Maddox Ellison, alone in the basement, excavating earth by hand or with a small bore tool, shoring walls with materials he'd ordered from catalogs, sealing the passage against groundwater, installing the door, all while I was at Hessler Regional learning about the Missouri Compromise and the mitochondria. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you would have told your mother, and she would have used it as evidence." Evidence. He meant evidence that he was unwell. Evidence for the custody argument she never actually made, because she left without fighting for me, which was its own kind of verdict. "Does it work?" I asked. "I test it quarterly. Last test was September 1st. The shed hatch operates cleanly." I bent and looked at the small steel door. It was maybe 4 feet high, 3 feet wide. You'd have to crouch to enter. A passage built for escape, not comfort. I noticed something about the handle and felt my stomach contract. "There's no handle on the other side," I said. "You can only open it from in here." "Correct. So once you're in the tunnel, you can't come back." My father looked at me with an expression I'd never catalogued in 16 years of reading his face. It wasn't patience, pity, or the flat efficiency of his checklist demeanor. It was something raw, exposure, as if the tunnel had been his most private thought, and I was now standing inside it. "The tunnel is an exit, Cade, not a round trip. If you use it, you've decided the house is no longer viable, and you don't come back. What about you? What about me? If I leave through the tunnel, what do you do?" "I stay. This is my position." Position, a military word, a word that meant, this is where I have decided to die, and I have fortified it accordingly. The house was not a home, and had never been a home. It was Maddox Ellison's chosen ground, and the tunnel existed not for his escape, but for mine. No one-way passage that separated the son from the father, the future from the fear, the person who could leave from the person who had built a place to stay forever. I understood then why the shutter over his bedroom had no manual open option. I had noticed it during my study of the utility panel. Every bedroom shutter could be manually opened from inside except his. His was wired to manual lock only. Even if the timer failed, Even if the power died, his shutter would remain closed. He had designed himself into a room with no way to see out. I spent the rest of inventory moving in mechanical compliance, counting cans and checking dates. My father recorded numbers and said nothing further about the tunnel. We sealed the shelf back into position and went upstairs for dinner. That night, lying in my steel-shuttered bedroom, I replayed the conversation and located the detail that frightened me most. Not the tunnel's existence, not the one-way door, the quarterly testing, September 1st. He had walked that passage alone, emerged in the equipment shed, confirmed the hatch worked, returned to the house through the yard, and then sealed himself back inside, satisfied that his son's escape route was functional, having never once considered using it himself. I began planning on day 16. Not dramatically, no stolen blueprints, no midnight tool gathering, just a slow, deliberate accumulation of understanding that mirrored my father's own methodology so precisely it made my skin crawl. The facts were these. The tunnel exited at the equipment shed, 41 feet north-northeast. From the shed, County Road 4 was accessible heading north through the Renford property, approximately half a mile of open soybean field and a wire fence. County Road 4 ran east-west. If I followed it east for approximately 3 miles, it would intersect County Road 9 near the grain elevator where Porter Vance and his daughter Bree were sheltered. The obstacles were also clear. The periscope surveys showed a fluctuating population of infected in the fields around our property, anywhere from a dozen to 30, depending on the time of day. They were less active at night, though not inactive. Through the periscopes, I had observed that they responded to sound more than movement, and that their response was directional but imprecise. A sharp noise would orient them toward its source. But they seemed unable to locate a silent, slow-moving figure at more than 50 or 60 yards. I needed supplies for a 4-mile walk through open rural terrain. Water, food, a light source, and something to orient myself if I lost the road in darkness. My father's provisions were inventoried to the can, so I couldn't take anything from the shelves without it appearing in his next count. Instead, I began eating less at meals and pocketing the difference, a granola bar here, a can of peaches there, storing them in my bedroom closet behind a box of old schoolwork. The moral architecture of what I was doing was more complex than the logistics. I was planning to leave my father alone in a house he had designed to die in. I was planning to use the escape route he had built for me, the expression of whatever love existed beneath his engineering, and walk toward a stranger's voice on a radio. I was choosing Porter Vance's improvised, uncertain survival over Cade Ellison's calculated, permanent entombment. And I was not going to tell him, because telling him would trigger a response I could predict with absolute certainty. He would not argue. He would not plead. He would simply lock the tunnel door. He had no lock on the inside, but he was a machinist. He could fabricate one in an hour from materials in the basement. If I told him, he would seal my exit with the same calm precision he applied to every other modification, and I would remain inside his house until the provisions ran out, or the world rebuilt itself around us, or I became as permanently enclosed as he was. On day 18, the radio delivered something that collapsed my timeline. Porter Vance's voice returned, weaker, thinner, but recognizable. "This is Porter at the Colburn grain elevator. Update for anyone monitoring. Bree and I are stable. We found additional supplies in the elevator office, canned goods, bottled water, some tools. The south entrance remains secure. But I've noticed the infected, or whatever they are, they're thinning out. Moving east in groups, slow, like migration. The area around the elevator has fewer of them than last week. I don't know if this is a pattern or temporary. If anyone is nearby and considering moving, the next few days might be a window." He paused. When he spoke again, his voice had a quality I recognized, the sound of a man speaking to a void and trying to believe it wasn't one. "Bree drew a picture today of our house. She asked me when we're going home. I told her soon. I don't know if that's true, but I told her soon." The transmission ended. I stood alone in the kitchen. My father was in the basement, calibrating the generator's fuel mixture, and I felt the window Porter described as a physical sensation. A thinning. A brief opening in the architecture of danger that would close again without announcement or schedule. I moved my timeline to 3 days. Day 21. That would place me at roughly the midpoint between new moon and first quarter, enough darkness for concealment, enough ambient light from stars to navigate by road. I packed my closet cash into my school backpack that evening. 4 cans of food, 2 bottles of water, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a folding knife from my father's workbench, and a county road map I had found in the junk drawer. Printed, not digital, because digital required a phone that required a cell network that no longer existed. At dinner, my father asked me to pass the salt. I passed it. He thanked me. We ate in the silence of 2 people who had nothing to say and everything to withhold. Day 20 arrived and brought a complication I had not modeled. My father was sick, not dramatically, not suddenly. A cough that had started on day 17 as a dry, occasional bark had deepened into something wet and persistent. He dismissed it. Dust from the basement work, nothing more. But I had spent 16 years calibrating my responses to his body language, and I could see the toll. He moved slower. He rested his hand on surfaces as he walked, not leaning but stabilizing. During the afternoon periscope check, he bent into a coughing fit that lasted 40 seconds and left him braced against the wall with both palms, breathing through his nose in controlled bursts. "You need the medical station," I said. "I need to finish the perimeter count." "I'll do the count. Go downstairs." He looked at me. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not gratitude, exactly, but a recalibration, as if I had moved from one column in his ledger to another, from dependent to functional, from protected to participant. "Northeast quadrant first," he said. "Count carefully. Distinguish between stationary and mobile." "I know the protocol." He went downstairs. I did the count. Northeast, 9 stationary, 2 mobile. East, 6 stationary. South, 3, all mobile. Moving east consistent with the migration pattern Porter had described. West, clear. Northwest, 1 figure at extreme range, possibly a fence post. I logged it as 1 probable, unconfirmed. When I went to the basement to report, my father was at the medical station. He had the field surgery manual open to a respiratory section and was listening to his own breathing with a stethoscope pressed to his chest. The image was so precisely, painfully him. A man treating his own illness with the same procedural discipline he applied to maintaining the generator that I had to look away. "Likely bronchitis," he said, "possibly early pneumonia. Treated with rest and hydration, which are available. Antibiotics would be preferable. They're on the supply list, but I never acquired them." A gap. A gap. In 20 years of preparation, of steel plates and laminated checklists and 41-foot tunnels, Cade Ellison had missed antibiotics. The gap was so human, so unlike the machine I had built him into in my mind, that it momentarily unmade every grievance I held against him. I started, and then stopped. I had almost said it, almost told him that I knew about Porter Vance and the grain elevator, that I had been planning to leave, that I could go now and look for medicine. But the sentence would have required dismantling every secret I had built. And more importantly, it would have given him a reason to seal the tunnel. "You can what?" he asked. "I can make dinner early. You should eat and rest." He accepted this with a nod. I went upstairs and heated 2 cans of soup and brought one down to him. He ate sitting on the folding cot he kept near the medical station, another preparation I had always considered excessive. Now it held a sick man, and its purpose was as clear and justified as every other decision he had made. That night, his coughing echoed through the house's steel bones. Sound traveled strangely in the sealed structure, muffled by shutters and foam from the outside, amplified and channeled along interior walls from within. Each cough reached my bedroom as a resonant, hollow percussion, like someone striking the hull of a ship from inside. I lay in the dark and recalculated. Leaving tomorrow, day 21, my planned departure meant leaving a sick man alone. A man who could not run, could not fight, could barely breathe without triggering a spasm. A man whose own escape tunnel had no return. If something went wrong with the generator while he was too weak to fix it, the ventilation system would fail. If his cough worsened into pneumonia and the antibiotics he didn't have became the difference between living and dying, there would be no one to help. But staying meant the window closed. Porter's observation about thinning migration was time-limited. The figures in the field would drift back, or new ones would arrive. And the path to County Road 9 would seal itself with the same finality as one of my father's shutters. I sat up in bed and pressed my forehead against the steel plate behind my headboard. It was cool, constant, absolute in the way only metal is absolute. My father had put this plate here to protect me, and now it was the wall between what I owed him and what I needed to become. Day 21 was tomorrow. I set my internal alarm and closed my eyes. I woke at 4 in the morning. The house was dark except for the generator's indicator light, which pulsed green in the basement stairwell like a mechanical heartbeat. My father was asleep on the folding cot downstairs. I could hear his breathing through the floor. Labored but rhythmic, punctuated by coughs that came in clusters and then subsided. I dressed in dark clothing. Jeans, a navy work shirt, boots with rubber soles that wouldn't scrape on concrete or gravel. I had thought about each item the way my father thought about his modifications functionally, without sentiment. Dark colors for concealment, rubber soles for silence. The work shirt because it was heavy enough to resist cold and fitted enough not to catch on tunnel walls. My backpack was already packed. I lifted it from the closet, shouldered it, and stood in my bedroom for 30 seconds, looking at the space I had occupied for 16 years. The bed my father had built from lumber he milled himself. The desk where I had done homework under a lamp he'd wired to the generator's backup circuit so it would never go out during a power failure. The closet where my mother's absence was cataloged in the clothes she hadn't taken: a winter coat, a pair of boots, a scarf with a pattern I could still feel against my face if I concentrated. I left the room and walked downstairs in my rubber-soled boots, each step placed with a precision that was entirely my father's legacy. At the basement stairs, I paused and listened. His breathing was steady. The cough had subsided into a wet rattle that rose and fell with each exhalation. He was deeply asleep, the exhausted, pharmaceutical-quality sleep of a body fighting infection. He wouldn't wake easily. I descended. The basement was cool and smelled of concrete, propane, and the metallic undertone of stored canned food. The generator hummed. The medical station's lamp cast a yellow puddle of light over the cot where my father slept on his back. His hands folded on his chest in a posture that looked less like rest and more like rehearsal. I moved to the shelving unit that concealed the tunnel. I had practiced the latch release twice during inventory sessions, memorizing the motion: lift, rotate, pull. The shelf swung open on its hinges with a sound I had to absorb with my body, catching the frame before it could bump the adjacent unit. The tunnel door was behind it. Small steel handle on this side only. I turned and looked at my father one more time. The green generator light pulsed across his face, giving him a rhythm he didn't have while awake, a softness, a vulnerability that his consciousness would never permit. His hands on his chest, his boots still on, because Cade Ellison did not remove his boots during an emergency, even to sleep, even when the emergency was contained behind every defense he had spent 2 decades building. I wanted to leave him something. A note, an explanation. But anything I wrote would be a lie, because the truth I am leaving, because your house is a cage, and I choose uncertainty over your architecture, was something no note could hold without cruelty. Instead, I did 2 things. First, I moved the antibiotics question into action. In the medical station cabinet, I found a bottle of ibuprofen and a packet of decongestant tablets, not what he needed, but better than nothing. I placed them on the folding table next to his cot with a glass of water from the hand pump. He would understand the gesture and its subtext. I knew you were sicker than you admitted, and I prepared what I could. Second, I reset the shutter utility panel upstairs, moving his bedroom shutter from manual lock to timer controlled. If he survived his illness and the world rebuilt itself, and one morning the threat receded, he would have the option to see outside. He would never choose it himself, but I could leave the choice, even if he never exercised it. I returned to the basement, opened the tunnel door. The passage beyond was dark and narrow and smelled of earth and sealant. My flashlight illuminated rough concrete walls, a gravel floor, and a low ceiling that would require me to move in a crouch, 41 feet. My father had measured it precisely, and I believed him, because Cade Ellison did not approximate. I entered the tunnel and pulled the door shut behind me. It closed with a definitive compression, the gasket sealing, the handle retracting, the mechanism locking from the inside as designed. The sound it made was the sound of leaving home. Not the house, not the structure. Home, the only version of safety I had ever known. Built by a man who loved me the only way he knew how, in steel and silence and preparation for the worst. 41 feet. I started walking. The tunnel was exactly what my father would build. Over-engineered, functional, and devoid of any comfort beyond structural integrity. The walls were poured concrete, reinforced with rebar I could see at the joints. The floor was packed gravel over a drainage layer. I could feel the crunch of stone beneath my boots and the slight give of engineered substrate below that. The ceiling cleared my head by 4 inches when I crouched, which meant my father had built it to his own height, minus the margin he considered acceptable for emergency movement. I covered the 41 feet in under 2 minutes. The tunnel ended at a vertical shaft, a steel ladder bolted to the wall, leading up to a hatch I could see as a dark rectangle above me. I climbed. The hatch had a simple latch, and when I pushed it open, cold October air fell into the shaft like water into a well. I emerged into the equipment shed. The riding mower sat exactly where my father had described, offset to conceal the hatch. The shed smelled of gasoline and cut grass and the mineral tang of fertilizer bags stacked along the north wall. Through the shed's single window glass, not steel, because the shed was outside his perimeter, I could see the field. Dawn was still an hour away. The sky held that particular darkness that precedes first light, not black but a deep, suspended blue, heavy with stars that the absence of artificial light had restored to a density I had never seen. The Milky Way was visible, which meant every light in Colburn and Hessler and beyond, was dead. I opened the shed door 6 inches and listened. The field was quiet. Not the sealed, manufactured quiet of the house, but the organic quiet of a landscape holding its breath. Wind moved the dried soybean plants in a continuous, papery whisper. Something distant, an owl or a mechanical sound I couldn't place, pulsed once and stopped. No shuffling, no dragging gait, no circling. I stepped out and pulled the door shut behind me. The air hit my face with a clarity that was almost violent after 21 days of recirculated, filtered, generator-warmed atmosphere. I could taste the season, the decay of harvest, the mineral edge of approaching frost, the distant smoke of something that had burned and stopped burning days ago. I moved north through Gil Renford's soybean field following the rouse. The plants came to my waist, dry and brittle, and each step produced a rustling I couldn't eliminate. I compensated by moving slowly, pausing every 20 steps to listen, scanning the darkness for movement that didn't match the wind. At the wire fence marking the Renford property line, I stopped. Beyond the fence, a dirt access road ran parallel to the wire, and beyond that, County Road 4 stretched east-west in a pale ribbon of gravel that caught the starlight. The road was empty in both directions. No vehicles, no figures. The thinning that Porter had described seemed to hold the landscape had a depleted quality, as if the infected had passed through and moved on, leaving behind a vacancy that was eerie but navigable. I climbed the fence, snagging my shirt on a barb and tearing a 3-inch strip from the hem. The sound of fabric ripping was unreasonably loud in the stillness. I froze, straddling the wire, and waited. Nothing responded. I dropped to the far side and crouched in the ditch beside County Road 4. East. 3 miles to the intersection with County Road 9. Another mile south to the grain elevator. 4 miles total. Walking speed in darkness on gravel, accounting for caution and periodic stops, roughly 2 hours. I would arrive near dawn. I started walking. The gravel crunched under my boots, no matter how carefully I placed them. So I moved to the grass shoulder, which was quieter but uneven, demanding attention from my ankles and knees. The road ahead was straight and featureless, bordered by fence rows and dormant fields, and the act of walking it alone, in darkness, without steel above and below and around me, produced a sensation I could not immediately categorize. It took me half a mile to name it. Freedom, not joy, not relief, not triumph. Those were emotions with direction and purpose. This was something more fundamental. The simple physical experience of moving through space, without a ceiling, without walls, without the constant low-frequency hum of a generator circulating air through a sealed system. My lungs filled differently out here. My vision reached to the horizon instead of terminating at steel plate. For the first time, 21 days, I existed in the world instead of adjacent to it. I walked east, and the stars turned above me, and I was afraid, and I was free. I encountered the first infected at mile 2. It was standing in the middle of County Road 4, facing east, motionless. I saw it from 100 yards, a silhouette against the marginally lighter eastern horizon, shaped wrong in the way that I had learned to read through the periscope, but now had to process at human distance, without steel between us. The figure was male, tall. Wearing what might have been a postal uniform, the color was indistinct in pre-dawn light. But the shape of the shorts and the knee-high socks were incongruous enough to register. He stood with his arms slightly raised from his sides, palms forward, as if he had been walking and simply stopped mid-stride and forgotten the rest of the sequence. I halted. My heart produced a rhythm that would have violated my father's noise discipline protocols. I breathed through my nose, slowly, and assessed. The ditch to my left was deep enough to conceal me if I crawled. The field to my right was harvested corn stubble and bare earth, no cover. The road was the only viable path, and this figure occupied it. I chose the ditch. I lowered myself into it, feeling cold water immediately soak through my jeans to mid-calf. The ditch was a drainage channel, and recent rain had left 3 inches of standing water under a layer of dead leaves. I crouched and moved east, keeping the road grade between me and the figure, placing each step with a deliberation that turned 50 yards into 10 minutes. At my closest point to the figure, roughly 30 yards, I looked up through the roadside grass and saw it in profile. The postal worker's face was visible now in the growing light, and it confirmed everything the emergency broadcast had described and nothing it had prepared me for. The features were intact but evacuated. The eyes were open, directed at nothing, responding to no stimulus I could identify. The mouth was ajar in a permanent, purposeless gape. There was no aggression in the posture. There was no curiosity, no hunting behavior, no predatory orientation. There was simply presence, a body standing in a road because it had arrived there and lacked the volition to leave. I passed it. It did not turn. It did not register my movement or the soft sounds of water under my boots. I continued east through the ditch until I was 100 yards past, then climbed back to the road shoulder with legs that trembled from cold and adrenaline. The next mile produced 2 more encounters, both manageable. A figure crouched in a farmhouse driveway, rocking forward and back over something I chose not to identify. Another standing at a fence line, facing into a field. Its hands wrapped around the top wire in a grip that suggested it had grabbed the fence while still capable of intention and had been holding on since. I gave each of them a wide berth. I moved through the landscape like a sentence through a redacted document, present but careful, threading between the blacked-out parts. The intersection of County Road 4 and County Road 9 appeared as the sky began to lighten in earnest. A green road sign, pocked with rust and birdshot, read CR9 with an arrow pointing south. I turned and followed it. County Road 9 was narrower than 4 single-lane, gravel thinning to dirt in patches, bordered by overgrown ditches and leaning telephone poles whose wires sagged with the weight of a system that had stopped carrying current. The grain elevator became visible at a quarter-mile, a tall cylindrical concrete structure flanked by metal outbuildings and a loading dock. All of it ringed by a gravel lot that was empty except for a burgundy pickup truck parked near the south entrance. Porter Vance's truck. Out of gas, exactly where he had described it. I approached from the east, using the outbuildings as cover. The lot was clear, no figures, no movement, just gravel and the truck and the elevator's concrete flank catching the first direct sunlight of the day. The south entrance was a steel personnel door with a window reinforced by interior mesh. I could see light inside, artificial yellow, a battery lantern or a candle. I stood at the door and raised my fist. 3 knocks. The signal Porter had broadcast to an empty frequency 3 weeks ago, hoping someone was listening. Silence. Then the sound of movement inside. Quick, light, multiple footsteps. The metallic slide of a deadbolt. The door opened 4 inches, chain limited, and a face appeared in the gap. Not Porter's face. A child's face. Dark eyes, tangled hair, a chin set with a determination that had no business belonging to an 11-year-old. 3 knocks, she said. Are you real? I'm real, I said. Bree Vance opened the door fully and I stepped into the grain elevator as the sun crested the tree line behind me. The interior was vast, a cathedral of agricultural engineering, all vertical space and concrete walls, and the residual sweetness of stored grain that had been removed months ago. The ground floor was a processing area, cluttered with machinery I couldn't name. And in one corner, Porter Vance had built a living space out of office furniture, moving blankets, and the kind of organizational determination that reminded me, with a discomfort I didn't want to examine, of my father. Porter himself was sitting in an office chair near the utility sink he had described on the radio. He was younger than I expected, mid-30s, with a lean build and the calloused hands of someone who worked outdoors. His right leg was extended in front of him, splinted with a length of aluminum shelving and wrapped in strips torn from a moving blanket. He looked up at me with an expression that combined relief, wariness, and the specific dignity of a man who does not want to be seen as helpless in front of his daughter. "Bree, get back from the door," he said. Then to me, "Who are you?" "Cade Ellison. I live 3 miles west. I heard your transmissions." "On what equipment?" "Emergency radio, hand crank." He studied me with an appraisal that was parental in its thoroughness, checking my hands, my eyes, my posture, the condition of my clothes, the backpack. "You walked here? In the dark?" "Yes." "Alone?" "Yes." "How old are you?" 16. He absorbed this. Something in his expression reorganized. The wariness retreated, replaced by a complex mixture of concern and recalibration. I was not the rescue he had been broadcasting for. I was a teenager with a backpack and 4 cans of food and a flashlight. "You're hurt," I said, nodding at his leg. "Broken tibia. Happened the night we reached the elevator. I was carrying Bree across the parking lot and stepped in a drainage grate. Clean break, I think, but I can't confirm without imaging. I said it myself." He said this matter-of-factly, but Bree, who had returned to a nest of blankets near the utility sink, looked at me with an expression that told the full story. Her father had broken his leg in the dark while carrying her to safety, and he had set the bone without anesthesia while she watched. And he had not screamed because she was there, and fathers do not scream when their daughters are watching. "I brought food," I said, shrugging off my backpack. "Not much. 4 cans, 2 water bottles." "We're not bad on food," Porter said. The elevator office had a break room, vending machine, mini fridge, cabinets. Whoever worked here last left supplies. Waters covered the utility sink runs from a ground tank fed by a roof collection system. Grain elevators need water for dust suppression. Lucky. "What do you need?" He hesitated. This was the question he didn't want to answer in front of Bree, and I could see him weighing honesty against protection. "Mobility," he said finally. "I can't walk. Bree can't carry me. We're safe here, but we're stuck. If the infected return in numbers, or if the water system fails, or if anything changes, we can't move." "So you need the truck to run." "The truck needs gas. There's a farm supply depot about a mile north on 9. It has above-ground diesel tanks, and the truck is diesel. But a mile north and a mile back with a fuel container, past whatever's out there, I can't do it." He looked at me, and I understood what he was asking without him saying it. He was asking a 16-year-old stranger to walk 2 miles through infected territory to retrieve fuel for a truck that might or might not start after 3 weeks of dormancy, so that a man with a broken leg and an 11-year-old girl could drive to somewhere that might or might not be safer than a grain elevator. My father would have called this an unnecessary risk. My father would have been right. "Where's the fuel container?" I asked. Porter pointed to the loading dock area. A red plastic jerry can sat against the wall, 5-gallon capacity, empty. "Dad," Bree said from her blankets, "he just got here." "I know, sweetheart. He should eat first." She was right. I was trembling from cold and exertion, and the residual adrenaline of walking 4 miles through darkness past things that used to be human. I sat down on an overturned crate and opened one of my canned peaches, the first thing my hand found, and ate them with my fingers, while Bree watched me with the serious, evaluative gaze of a child who has learned to assess adults by their actions rather than their words. I left for the fuel depot at mid-morning, after Porter drew me a map on the back of a grain receipt. The depot was a farm co-op supply station. Not a gas station, he emphasized, but a bulk storage facility where local farmers filled equipment. The diesel tanks were above ground, gravity-fed with manual hand pumps. No electricity required. The pump handles are locked with a standard padlock, Porter said. But the lock is decorative. The hasps are rusted. A good hit with a rock will break them. How do you know this? Because I tried to reach the depot the second night, before I broke my leg. I got 300 yards up the road and turned back. There were too many of them between me and it. But I could see the tanks from the road. I could see the locks. He handed me the jerry can. 5 gallons of diesel weighs roughly 35 pounds. The round trip was 2 miles. I calculated the weight, the distance, and the unknowns. And I felt my father's arithmetic running in my head like background software I couldn't uninstall. I took the can and left through the south entrance. The morning was bright and cold. The sky a washed blue that made the landscape look like a photograph of itself. I walked north on County Road 9, keeping to the grass shoulder, scanning constantly. The road was clear for the first quarter mile. Then I saw them. A group of 7, clustered near a pickup truck that had run into a drainage ditch on the east side of the road. They weren't moving, just standing near the truck in a loose semicircle, oriented toward the vehicle as if they remembered that trucks were significant but couldn't reconstruct why. The truck's driver's side door was open. I did not look at the cab. I crossed to the west side of the road and gave the group a berth of 80 yards, moving through a harvested cornfield with the jerry can tucked under my arm to prevent it from swinging. The stubble crunched, but the group didn't respond. They remained fixated on the truck and its open door and whatever memory of purpose still operated in their degraded systems. The depot appeared at the 3/4 mile mark, a metal-sided building with Colburn Farm Co-op, painted in fading letters across the front, flanked by 2 cylindrical steel tanks on elevated platforms. A gravel apron surrounded the building, and a chain-link fence enclosed the tank area, with a gate that stood open. No figures, no movement. The facility had the evacuated stillness of a place that humans had left in a hurry and nothing else had found worth occupying. I entered the tank area and located the diesel pump, a hand crank unit mounted on the side of the nearer tank, with a rubber hose and a nozzle that hung from a hook. The padlock was as Porter described: rusted, decorative, attached to a hasp that yielded to 2 strikes from a chunk of concrete. I pried from the apron's edge. I positioned the jerry can under the nozzle and began cranking. The pump was stiff from disuse, and each rotation produced a grinding resistance, followed by a gush of amber diesel that splashed into the can with a sound that carried farther than I wanted. I pumped steadily, watching the can fill, watching the road, watching the field. The smell of diesel was overwhelming, a chemical sharpness that seemed to announce my presence to every sensory system in a mile radius. The can filled in 4 minutes. I capped it, cleaned the nozzle, and hung the hose back on its hook. 35 pounds of fuel, a mile of road, and whatever the noise had attracted. I picked up the can and started south. The weight changed everything. My pace dropped. My free hand lost its ability to brace or balance. The can's handle cut into my palm, and I had to switch hands every 100 yards. each transfer producing a sloshing sound I couldn't muffle. At the half-mile mark, returning past the pickup truck, the group of 7 had changed. They had dispersed. 3 remained near the truck, but 4 had moved south along the road, spacing themselves at irregular intervals, like markers on a course I was being directed to run. They weren't pursuing me. They were simply occupying the road ahead, with the passive obstruction of fallen trees or standing water. I left the road entirely. Cutting west into the cornfield, carrying 35 pounds of diesel through stubble and furrows, my boots sinking in soil that had been softened by rain. Each step was an extraction. Each extraction was a sound. And somewhere behind me, close enough to register as pressure, but not yet close enough to see, something had started following. I heard it before I saw it. A crackling advance through the corn stubble, a rhythmic but directional, tracking not my position, but the corridor of noise I was creating through the harvested field. I adjusted my path, angling south and east toward the elevator, and risked to look over my shoulder. A single figure, 200 yards back, moving through the field with the characteristic listing gait, a broken compass needle orienting and reorienting toward the sounds of my passage. It wasn't fast. It wasn't coordinated. But it was persistent. And persistence, as my father's house had taught me, was the resource that required no intelligence to deploy. I increased my pace. The jerry cans slammed against my thigh with each step, diesel sloshing in counterpoint to my breathing. The elevator was visible now, its concrete cylinder rising above the tree line, like a monument to a form of civilization that might not return. 800 yards, 600, 400. At 200 yards, the figure behind me was joined by a second, emerging from the tree line to the east with a stumbling momentum that suggested it had been walking for hours and had found, in my noise, a reason to continue. Neither was close enough to overtake me at my current pace. But the margin was thinner than I wanted, and thinning with every step. I reached the elevator's gravel lot at a run, the jerry can banging against my leg, and hammered on the south entrance with my free hand. 3 knocks. The door opened immediately. Bree must have been watching from the mesh window, and I spilled inside. Fuel can first, then my body, then the door slamming shut, and the deadbolt sliding home. I sat on the concrete floor and breathed. The diesel can stood beside me like a trophy from a contest I hadn't agreed to enter. Through the mesh window, I could see the 2 figures reach the edge of the gravel lot, slow and stop. They stood at the perimeter and oriented toward the building, with that same vacant, purposeless attention I had observed through my father's periscopes. "You're fast," Bree said from behind me. "I'm motivated," I said. Porter was already examining the fuel can. 5 gallons. That's enough for maybe 80 miles in the truck, depending on conditions. Enough to reach Hessler at minimum. Is Hessler safe? I don't know, but it's bigger. And bigger means more resources, more survivors, more options. It's better than here. He paused. "Help me to the truck." This was the part I had not considered: moving a man with a broken tibia from the elevator to a vehicle 50 feet away, loading his daughter, fueling the truck, and starting an engine that had been sitting dormant for 3 weeks. All while figures gathered in the lot, like a tide responding to a moon I couldn't see. We worked in stages. First, I took the fuel can to the truck, opened the fuel cap, and poured all 5 gallons into the tank. The diesel gurgled in with a sound that was absurdly domestic, a sound from a world where people filled trucks on Tuesday mornings and drove to hardware stores and came home and didn't bolt their windows shut. Next, I returned for Bree. She carried a backpack stuffed with supplies from the break room cans, water bottles, a first aid kit she had assembled with the same meticulous attention her father brought to his radio transmissions. She walked to the truck without hesitation, climbed into the back seat, and buckled her seatbelt. The normalcy of the gesture, a child buckling a seatbelt, was so dislocating that I stood in the lot for a full 3 seconds, processing it, before I went back for Porter. He was heavier than he looked. I braced him on my left side, his arm across my shoulders, and we moved in a 3-legged stagger that covered 50 feet in what felt like 50 minutes. Each step on his broken leg produced a compression of his features that he refused to translate into sound. He gritted through it with a silence that I recognized, the silence of a father who will not let his child hear him suffer. I got him into the passenger seat, ran back to the elevator for the last of the supplies, pulled the south entrance shut and returned to the truck, climbed into the driver's seat. "I don't have a license," I said. "I'll add it to the list of things that don't matter anymore," Porter said. "Keys in the visor." I pulled the visor down. A single key on a carabiner clip dropped into my palm. I put it in the ignition and turned it. The engine coughed, turned over, coughed again, caught. The truck rumbled to life with a vibration that traveled through the steering wheel, into my hands, and up my arms, and into the part of my chest that had been clenched since the moment I entered my father's tunnel. South out of the lot, then west on 9 to 4, then north on 4 toward Hessler. Porter said, "Go." I went. We reached Hessler at noon. The town was damaged, but inhabited. A cluster of survivors had fortified the high school gymnasium with the kind of improvised, imperfect barricades that would have made my father wince. Sandbags, overturned bleachers, a school bus parked across the main entrance. They had a medical station staffed by a veterinarian named Collier Braun, who set Porter's leg properly and told Bree she was the bravest patient he'd ever had, which made her roll her eyes in a way that confirmed she was going to be fine. I stayed in Hessler through the winter. I helped reinforce the gymnasium. I taught people how to purify water and bake bread and check structural integrities, skills my father had deposited in me like seeds in a vault, meant for a season he knew would come. In February, when the military corridor opened and convoys began running supply routes through the county, I asked a sergeant if there was a protocol for checking on isolated survivors in the rural townships. He said there was, and I gave him my father's address. They found him alive. The house was intact. The generator was running. The provisions were at month 4 levels, consistent with single occupancy consumption. Cade Ellison was sitting at the kitchen table with his radio and his coffee, and when the soldiers knocked, he did not open the door until they identified themselves by name, rank, and unit number, because a knock without verification was an unnecessary risk. He asked them one question: whether a boy named Cade had been located in the Hessler area. They told him yes. He nodded, and he closed the door, and the soldiers reported that through the steel, they heard a sound that they couldn't identify. I can. I've heard that sound once before the night my mother left, after my bedroom light was off and he thought I was sleeping. My father was weeping.